If you look at a red maple, uh, you look at 3 red maples out in the woods, and the bark is not, it may look completely different among those 3. Some similarities enough to tell what it is, but you take twigs from all those, and those are going to look pretty similar. So even if you learn how to identify trees by the bark, it's still a good idea to check yourself with the twigs. I think it's just it's a good way to put that in motion. And we'll start off here. If you'll pick up your number 1, and I'll try to get that in front of the camera here. This is one I always like to start with. And I'll just tell you up front what this is. This is a black gum. And one way you know it's black gum is it's got that, if you look at the sample that you have, it's got that very reddish brown color to that terminal bud. And this just has a lot of the features and a lot of the words that we're going to be using, the terminology with twigs. So I like to start out with this one, even though this one is more nondescript than some of the others that you're liable to see tonight. But this one, when you've got that bud right on the tip, that's called a terminal bud. When you've got buds on the twig, those are called lateral buds. And that can be a good way to identify if you're using a key, because they may ask, is the terminal bud larger than the lateral buds, or are they the same size? And in some cases, they'll be the same size. In some cases, that terminal bud will be larger. Now, you may look at this initially and think that there are no lateral buds on this. You just have a terminal bud and you have a stick. But if you look very closely, you'll see some little holes, some little indentions in the twig, and those are the leaf scars. That's where the leaves were attached last year. If you imagine a leaf and you imagine how that stalk kind of swells at the base, well, that fit right in that leaf scar, just like you're plugging a cable into a computer. It fits in there, and that's where the leaf was attached. And if you look at those leaf scars under a microscope, sometimes you can see what's called vascular bundles. And sometimes there'll be just one dot in the center. Sometimes there'll be a series of dots. Sometimes they'll be in a certain shape. And the vascular bundle is where the xylem and phloem tissue moves from the leaf into the twig. So just like a connecting cable on your computer, it'll have all that information. It plugs in, and all those connections are there. Now, you can't see that very well on here, but there are lateral buds on this black gum. If you look down through here and look very close, you'll see little leaf scars, and you'll see tiny little buds right above the leaf scars. And if you can't see it, don't worry, because we'll look at some that are much larger and easier to see later. But this is one that just doesn't stand out when you're looking for those leaf scars, but they are on there. So that's the black gum. That's number 1. And another thing that you can see, if you look at that terminal bud, you can see scales. Everybody sees scales on there? Yep. So one of the identifiers, if you're trying to key out a bud, it may ask for the number of scales that you can see. It may ask, does it have scales or does it not have scales? So that's another piece of terminology that you'll run into, is scales. And an interesting thing about those buds were formed at the end of last season. So this has got all the leaf tissue inside of it. It's dormant, and it's just waiting for the right conditions to open up and start growing. And so people will talk about, well, maybe the bad winter will hurt the buds on this tree, but it won't, because this is already dormant. It's already programmed as to how it's going to grow. If we had a drought last fall, that might have impacted this bud, but right now it's safe. It's dormant. It's already programmed to how much it's going to grow. So this winter shouldn't affect these buds whatsoever. But number 1, that's a black gum. If you'll grab number 2 is a little bit more attractive. It's got this nice red color. It's very straight. And when you're hiking in the snow, this one really stands out. It's a small tree. This is a sourwood. And if you look at those twigs, you can definitely, the leaf scars are very prominent on this. If you look at that twig, you'll see those little pale circles. Everybody see those all along the twig? Okay, those little pale circles, that's the leaf scar. That's where the leaf of this sourwood was attached last year. It just plugged right in there. And if you look very closely, there's a tiny little bud up above each leaf scar. You see that, just like a little knot. That's a leaf bud. That will, when the conditions are right, that'll swell and that will become a leaf next growing season. When one of my sons was trying to learn his winter trees, we'd go out hiking and he would get this one mixed up a lot with red maple, because red maple will have this reddish color. It'll be very straight, but there's a very, very easy way to tell the difference. And I'll tell you that here in a bit, because we do have a red maple coming up. But that's the sourwood. Doesn't look like it has buds, but the buds are on there, and you can see the leaf scars pretty easily. So that's sourwood. I might have said something else, but that one is sourwood. Number 3 is when things start to get interesting. If you pick up number 3, first I'll ask you, if you look at that terminal bud, if you look at that bud on the end, do you see scales on that? And I'll put this up to the camera for those who don't have the twigs in front of them. Are there scales on that terminal bud? What do you all think? Aaron wants to say something. I can tell you.
No, I don't need to be heard. I was just guessing no.
No, that's correct. There are no scales on this. And this is what's called a naked bud. And some of the, let's say 2 or 3 of the ones that we see this evening will have a naked bud, meaning there's no scales on that. So what you're looking at is actual leaf tissue that's just dormant. It's formed into a bud. And again, just like with the others, this is waiting for the right conditions in spring to open up and start growing. So you'll see the naked bud there, the terminal bud, and also the lateral buds are naked. There's no scales on those lateral buds on the side. This is one that you can see the leaf scars very, very plainly. Everybody see the leaf scars underneath all those lateral buds? Very, very large. How would somebody describe the shape of those leaf scars? The one description I heard is heart-shaped. Everybody see sort of a heart shape there? And I've also heard them described as looking like like a cobra hood. If you look at if you're looking at a cobra, the way that hood looks on the back, you see that broad shape there? That's the leaf scar. And this one, does anybody know what this one is?
So yeah. What's that? I say it has a compound leaf.
Yes.
Is it hickory?
You're very close.
Pecan?
It does have a. No, you're still in the right family. This is a black walnut.
Black walnut.
Yep. So you see that naked bud, and you see those big big prominent heart-shaped or looking like a cobra hood leaf scars, that's a good indication it's a black walnut. And if you're just not sure and you cut off the twig, you can take a knife. Yeah, that's a little more plain than I thought it would be. You can cut into the twig itself, into the pith, and a walnut has what's called a chambered pith. So there are individual chambers in here. You can see the divisions in there. I don't know. But chambered pith, that naked bud, and those big prominent leaf scars. And if you look inside the leaf scar, you can see some dots in there. Those are those vascular bundles that I mentioned. That's where the vascular tissue, the xylem and phloem that carry the sugars and carry the water, that's where they run from the leaf into the twig and back out. Those are the vascular bundles. All right, moving along, let's look at number 4. This is the first one that we've seen. The ones that we've seen so far have been what we call alternate, which means looking again at number 3, you've got a leaf scar here, and then you've got a leaf scar here, and then you've got a leaf scar here. So those leaves were not right across from each other. These are alternate. They alternate from one area to the next. Number 4, if you look at your number 4, those are what we call opposite. So those buds are directly across from each other. Now that will help a lot in your identification, because with our native trees, there are only a handful that have that opposite leaf arrangement. And if you remember, and I'll type this into the chat, if you can remember this acronym, MADBUCK, that's going to tell us all the native trees that have that opposite leaf arrangement. M is for maple, A is for ash, D is for dogwood, and buck is short for buckeye. So those are the ones that will be opposite. In other words, they'll have the leaves straight across from each other. Now, very often, if you have one of these species, maple, ash, dogwood, or buckeye, not only will those leaves be directly across from each other, but you can look up at the limbs, and very often the limbs, you'll notice they'll be coming out of the trunk straight across from each other too. So it won't just be the leaves. And the one that I have, I kind of reserved it for myself, but this is a pretty good indication that sometimes nature can be a little bit off kilter, I guess. The one I have, there are 3 buds at every node. That's not typical, but for some reason, the one I cut, I know this is from a red maple, because I did cut some other twigs from the same tree. So sometimes you may run across something like that. That would be called a whorled leaf arrangement. So if I just looked at this one tree and I was trying to key it out, I would probably call this whorled, but you need to go by the average. You look at multiple ones, and this is going to be an opposite leaf arrangement. What could you say about the leaf scar beneath those lateral buds? Is it thin or is it thick?
It's very small.
Yes, very thin, almost like a very thin little smile. So not very prominent at all. And this is the one that my son would mix up when we were hiking in the winter, mix that up with the sourwood. But again, the sourwood is going to be alternate, and the red maple is going to be opposite. It's going to have those buds right across from each other. All right, moving on to number 5. First of all, look at those leaf scars on number 5, and do they look close to one that we've already seen?
More like the black walnut.
Yes, it's big and heart-shaped. Was that you, Elizabeth? And you don't even have twigs in
Yeah.
front of you. And you were seeing that. So that's those big heart-shaped leaf scars. Again, that's where the leaf was attached last year. It looks very similar to the black walnut. That's because it's in the same family. The hickories are in the walnut family. So this is a hickory, and I didn't key this out to species, but I'm guessing this is probably a pig nut. Most of our hickories, all but one that are native to this area, will have this terminal bud. It's not really scales. It's more of a wrap or a sheath that surrounds that terminal bud, like a turban. It reminds me of a turban. Everybody see that? Kind of a big, like a Hershey's Kiss shape to it. And I said all but one of our hickories will have that similar shape. And number 6 is the hickory that does not have that same shape. How would you describe the bud? Number 6 is also a hickory, but how would you describe this bud on number 6?
Looks more round shaped.
More round, maybe more narrow. What else?
Teardrop?
Yeah, a bit of a teardrop shape, but what else? What's missing? You don't have any kind of sheath, any kind of scale. This is what's called just like with the walnut, this is a naked bud. It's just the pure leaf tissue. And another thing that really stands out with this hickory, and this is bitternut hickory that I'm holding here, the one with the naked bud, it has a sulfur yellow color to it. So the terminal bud will be that sulfur yellow color, and also our lateral buds will have that sulfur yellow color. And if you're hiking in the snow, that can really stand out. You'll see that bright yellow color, and that's a bitternut hickory. There's really nothing else that looks like that. But again, you see those big prominent leaf scars, some fairly heart-shaped. So that's another one of the in the walnut family, but this is the bitternut hickory. It's the only hickory we have that has a naked bud. Okay. Now let's look at number 7. And I'll ask the question, is that leaf arrangement, is it opposite or is it alternate?
Opposite.
Yes, that's opposite. So we can narrow it down to a handful of species. What would those be?
Ash or maple or dogwood. It's not,
Yeah.
not or buckeye.
Yep. So it's one of those: maple, ash, dogwood, or buckeye. And one thing about this one is a lot of people will say that terminal bud, if you look straight down, it looks like a Phillips screwdriver. Is what it looks like. And that's a good way to remember this one. It's usually this brown color. That's usually how I see it as far as the coloration goes. Another thing about this one, if you feel of this twig at the nodes where those 2 buds are, it's kind of flattened. So if your fingers slide up and you come to that node, you'll feel how it kind of flattens out right there at the node where the buds are. That's also another common characteristic of this one. And this one is an ash. This one's the white ash. Again, that's a naked bud. There's no scale, no kind of sheath around that Phillips screwdriver there. But that is one of the opposite ones. So So just looking at that, we would know this is maple, ash, dogwood, or buckeye. And this one happens to be an ash. All right, if I can get this quiz to work, this survey poll function, I'm going to kind of walk you through what a dichotomous key is. If you're trying to identify trees in the summer or in the winter, there are several keys that you can use. And a dichotomous key, it'll give you two choices, and then your next question will be based on that choice. For example, your first question might be, is this a conifer or is this a deciduous tree? And if you think it's a conifer, then you go to question 2. If you think it's a deciduous tree, it may send you to question 6. And you would just keep doing that until you key it out. Now, this is one that I know Jeremy's familiar with this one. This is one that most of the national parks will have this in their gift shop. I think I picked this one up in Cumberland Gap Historical Park gift shop probably 10 or 12 years ago. And at the time it was $2. It's probably more than that now. But this is a very basic dichotomous key. It'll give you several questions that you ask, and then it'll send you to a page with a symbol based on what your answer is. And it's a really handy way to key out. And again, they have one for summer trees as well, if you're just looking at the leaves. But the winter tree one, this is probably the one I would start with if you're looking at a dichotomous key. So this is a really good one. And there's also one that Virginia Tech has on their website that I'll put a link up to a little later. So if you bring the twig in, you can key it out there from the Virginia Tech website. I have one and I couldn't find it this evening when I started looking for it, but it's about that thick. It's a dichotomous key that I had to have in college. It was called Woody Plants in Winter, and very detailed, but the problem is you have to use a glossary because it asks all these things that you're just terminology that I'm not familiar with. But it's kind of a clunky, clumsy thing to use. But this one, Winter Tree Finder is the name of that one. It's by May Thilgard Watts and Tom Watts. Those are the authors. But again, any of the national park gift shops, you should be able to pick that one up. That's a really good one. And so for number 8, I took some questions out of various dichotomous keys, and I'm going to try to get those posted for you. So the first one, number 8, we've got 4 questions about it. I'm going to give you all a chance to answer. So looking at the twig you have that's numbered 8, would you call the arrangement of branches, leaf scars, and buds opposite? Or your other choice is the arrangement of branches, leaf scars, and buds alternate. So I'll give you all a few seconds to answer that. Okay. Okay. So I'm going to end the poll. Okay, 8 people answered, and we're batting 1,000. Everybody got that correct. That number 8, it does have an alternate leaf arrangement. So going into the next question, again, regarding twig number 8, have a couple of choices here. Several buds of different sizes are clustered irregularly at the tip of the twig, or buds are not clustered. I'll give you all a few seconds on that one. Okay. Okay, most got it correct. Those buds are not considered clustered. Now they can be very close and that can be confusing, but at that terminal end, there's only a single bud and then there's a lateral bud just down from it. If they were clustered, there would be a lot just right in that same, it's like they're fighting for the same real estate. But this one is not clustered. So that would lead us to another question. And if we had our dichotomous key, for that first one, if we thought that those buds were clustered at the tip, it may say go to page 3. If the buds are not clustered, go to page 5. So the next question that's going to take us to, because we said those are not clustered. If you look close, and you may have to use a hand lens, but a line, which is actually a stipule scar, completely encircles the twig at each leaf scar. So at each leaf scar, there would be a thin line that completely encircles the twig. Or the second choice is there is no such line. And those of you without the twigs in hand, I apologize. I don't know if we can get close enough to see that or not. Okay, looks like you all are getting that one correct. I'll give you a few more seconds to answer. All right. Most everybody got that one. There is, and you might have had a sample that wasn't real visible, but at each leaf scar, if you look really closely, possibly with a hand lens, there is a thin, pale line that completely encircles that twig. So the first choice was the correct one. And if we're using our dichotomous key, then because we answered that, that will send us to a different set of questions. And this will be the final question for this particular twig. The first choice is the end bud is shaped like a duckbill. That's the terminal bud, shaped like a duckbill. In other words, it's got two halves that come together, quack, quack. Or the end bud is not shaped like a duckbill, but is egg-shaped, arrowhead-shaped, or oblong. Quack, quack. Okay. Most of you got it. Let's see. This one is what would be considered shaped like a duckbill. And if you want to get your fingernails in and divide those buds, the terminal bud up, they're just two scales and they do come together like a duckbill. And this is the only native tree that we have in this area that has those types of scales that looks like a duckbill. And this one is a tulip poplar or a tulip tree and has that duckbill terminal bud. And another thing about the tulip poplar, pretty obvious prominent leaf scars. You see those? How would you describe those? The leaf scars on the twig. I would describe them as circular. Everybody agree with that? It's almost not quite a perfect circle. But some of those leaf scars we've seen, like on the red maple, they were thin, like a very thin smile. Some were like a half D shaped. This is the only one that we've seen so far that leaf scar is in a circle. Everybody see that? So that's that kind of stands out. But the big thing with the tulip poplar is going to be that duckbill terminal bud. All right, our next one's number 9. This is another one that's pretty unique, really stands out. First of all, opposite or alternate on this one?
Opposite. I mean, alternate.
Alternate. Yeah, this is very obviously alternate because you got one here and one here. Does it have scales or does it not have scales? The buds.
I would say yes.
Yes. Yes, those do have scales. Is the terminal bud, is it much larger than the lateral buds? No, roughly the same size, maybe slightly larger, but all those buds are going to be roughly the same size. And I've heard a lot of kids describe this as a spear. Those buds are sort of a spear shape. This is American Beech. American Beech has those big spear shaped buds. And some of these have started to open on the one that I have, but very long, very narrow. That's American Beech. There's really not another native species that looks like that at all. Okay, number 10 is probably my favorite twig, if you can have a favorite twig. And somebody describe that bud to me. Just pet it, hold it, look at it. How would you describe that bud?
Soft and velvety.
Yes, soft, velvety, kind of a silver, fuzzy. Remember that we talked about the in our dichotomous key, we saw the tulip poplar. It had the line, the stipular scar that completely encircled the twig. Does this have the same thing? If you go to each leaf scar, does it have a line that completely encircles each twig? Yes. Yeah, because this is in the same family as the tulip poplar. The tulip poplar is in the magnolia family, and this is another of our native magnolias. And this is a great one. This one will jump out at you once you start noticing this. When you go on a hike in the wintertime, this one will just really almost jump out and bite you on the leg. It really stands out, that soft, velvety, silvery bud. This is a cucumber tree. Cucumber tree magnolia, one of our native magnolias. But that's what that silver bud would indicate. Number 11. This one, very obviously alternate. And this one doesn't have scales on the buds. It has a single scale, more of a sheath. And, again, I've talked to a lot of kids about identifying these in winter condition. That's been described as lipstick, a tube of lipstick. It's got that reddish color. It kind of is shaped like a tube of lipstick. And this is a sycamore. It's that lipstick or that bullet shaped. I've heard it called bullet shaped too. But that one's a sycamore. Lots of times a sycamore will tend to be sort of zigzagged as it goes from one node to the other. Another one that will do that is red bud. It'll have a zigzag shape, but it doesn't have buds that look like lipstick at all. So that one's a sycamore, number 11. Number 12, we're back to one more magnolia. This one has a large prominent terminal bud. Really, the lateral buds don't stand out at all, but that terminal bud is very large and prominent. It can be sort of a greenish color, a bluish color. It's very smooth. And this is a Fraser magnolia. And a couple other of our native magnolias will have a similar looking bud. The umbrella magnolia, the big leaf magnolia, they will look similar to this. So if you pick up number 12 and number 10 and number 8, those are all three in the same family. Those are all magnolias. So the tulip poplar, number 8, is a magnolia. The cucumber tree with that fuzzy bud, number 10, is a magnolia. And number 12 is the Fraser magnolia. Those are 3 of our native magnolias. Moving on, number 13, and then we'll do another dichotomous key activity for the last one, number 14. But looking at number 13, how would somebody describe that terminal bud? First of all, scales or not? This, I see several hand lenses out. Yeah, this one does not have scales. This is considered a naked bud. And some of the twigs, I don't think all of them had this, but you'll see some little round pom-pom like buds on the twig too. You'll have this one, which reminds me of a feather. This terminal bud kind of reminds me of a feather. It's got that feather shape to it, that naked bud. And then there's some round pom-pom like buds. The round ones are flower buds. This would be a leaf bud on the end. So this will become a leaf. And these round ones, if you have those on your twig, those are flower buds. And what we're looking at here is a pawpaw. This is a pawpaw tree. So if you have the 2 different buds, you can see leaf buds versus flower buds. All right, and for the last one, number 14, we'll just have a couple of questions on this one in our poll. And here's the first one. You have to look very closely at it. You can see that terminal bud, but then you have to find the leaf scars to answer this. But is the arrangement of the branches, leaf scars, and buds opposite? Or your other choice, the arrangement of branches, leaf scars, and buds is alternate? So I'll give you all a few minutes to answer that. And for those who don't have the twigs, I'll see if I can get a good clear shot. Okay, looks like we had 9 folks who answered, and 100% got it right. This is opposite. So again, we can narrow that down to maple, ash, dogwood, or buckeye, that mad buck. We're going to go on to the next question. We've answered this opposite, so that's going to lead us to the next one, which is going to be right here. So our first choice, the entire twig is 1/4 inch thick or more, and the terminal bud is oval and conspicuous. And then our next choice is the entire twig is not 1/4 inch or more thick, or does not have an oval conspicuous end bud. Okay. Did most of you got that right? It was, this is the thickest one that we have in the bundle. So this is a pretty thick twig, and that terminal bud, it is pretty oval, very conspicuous. It stands out. If you're hiking, usually along a lake or a river is where you'll see this, and those buds really stand out. And you can see the scales on those pretty well too. This one is a buckeye. So it does fit into that mad buck description. This is our buckeye here. All right, so those are I know we went through that pretty quickly, but those are the 14 buds that you all had. And hopefully if you didn't write down what those were and you want to kind of look at them a little closer, you just let me know. I'll be glad to email you the ID on each of those. So we got a few more minutes here. I just had a couple slides I wanted to share in regards to winter tree ID, some things to look for. Twigs and bark, we think about bark a lot being the way to identify trees in the winter, and that's fine. But like I said, the twigs, there's going to be less variation. So I think it's good to try to learn those twigs too, so you can back yourself up. And I'll tell you a way that I've used that a lot is I'm pretty good at identifying red maples versus sugar maples from the bark. But if I'm in an area where there's a whole lot of both, after I've seen a few, I start to second guess myself. And that's happened several times. And at that point, I'll start trying to grab a twig, because the red maple twigs and the sugar maple twigs look very different. And there's no mistake in those if you can get to a twig. The seed structures, that's another thing to look for. The red buds will have the beans. You'll have the sycamores that have the seed balls on them. The general tree form and shape is another factor you can look for in the winter, and I'll show you some examples of that. Last season's leaves, I think a lot of people think that that's cheating, but if you're looking at an oak, for example, and you're trying to figure out if that's a red oak or a white oak, there's no shame in looking at those brown leaves around the base and trying to see which type has the most leaves around the foot of that tree. And I've used that a lot. I used that method not long ago. We had a researcher who came to the Powell River Project. He was going to collect some wood samples from hybrid poplars, and I ended up I thought we were in the hybrid poplars. I didn't want to have him cut something wrong, so I was looking at the leaves on the ground to make sure that that's what we were collecting from. The location is a big one. Certain species like to have wet feet. Some species like to be on drier sites. And as an example, where would you typically see a sycamore? Usually you're going to, yes, wet sites along rivers. Now that's not 100%. I have run across sycamores on dry ridges, and you have to wonder what in the world it's doing there. But usually sycamores, they like to have wet feet. You're going to see them along the rivers, along the streams. What about chestnut oak? Where do you typically see those?
Dry side, ridge top.
Dry ridge top is where you normally run across those. So that's don't neglect that when you're trying to ID. Think about where you're at, what kind of site you're looking at, and that's going to help with a lot of species as far as your identification goes. And then aroma is one, and I was thinking of three that we can identify by smell. Anybody have want to think what those might be as far as our native trees.
No, I was gonna say autumn olives.
Somebody said one. Was that you, Merle?
No, birch is what I was thinking about.
Yeah, birch is one. You can break off that, scrape off a little bark or break off one of those twigs, and it'll have a wintergreen aroma. What else?
Pawpaws.
Sassafras.
Pawpaws, I heard that one. You may not know this, but pawpaw twigs and leaves, this one probably doesn't have any aroma left in it, but it'll smell like diesel fuel, or what was the other option to me? It's gotten where it smells like diesel fuel to me, but it's peppers, green peppers. And it's funny that people will, one person will smell it and they'll say it reminds them of green peppers, and the next one will say it smells like diesel fuel, but it's a pretty distinctive smell. And then of course sassafras is one. If you don't know you're dealing with a sassafras, the twig and the leaves will all have that lemony aroma to them. And then another thing, associated species, certain fungi, parasitic plants, even insects that are associated with those. Just checking the time here. We've got a couple minutes. This is one that I didn't collect an oak, but Kentucky and Virginia each have about 24 species of oaks in the state. And all the oaks that we're going to encounter around here, they're going to have a cluster of buds at the tip. So if you don't know you're dealing with an oak and you see a twig like this and it has multiple buds on the terminal end, that's an oak. And you'll have to take a few more steps to try to identify what species, but at least you'll know that you're looking at an oak because it'll have that cluster of buds on the tip. Sometimes we'll use the term blocky bark when we're talking about the trunk of a tree, and this is what we mean. There are a few species that have a blocky bark. Flowering dogwood is one. Persimmon is another. This particular tree is a black gum, just like the number one twig, and it's been described as alligator skin. You'll notice it's got lots of little squares along the bark. That's what we would call a blocky bark. But if you see that, especially if it's a large tree, then that's going to be usually going to be a black gum around here, that blocky bark. This one's pretty easy to identify. This is one of those that likes to have wet feet. You're going to see along the rivers. And to me, this pattern on the bark has always reminded me of woodland camouflage. You'll see that these have several layers. It'll have an outer brown layer and then a green layer of bark, and then you'll see the white inner bark. This is a sycamore. A lot of cases, people will see these from a distance and they'll only see the tops of the tree and they'll see the white. So they'll ask, what are those white trees along the river? But that's sycamore with that really distinctive camo-like bark. This is one of our hickories. Our hickories, they will have that cross-thatched pattern on the bark. So that's usually a good indication that you're looking at a hickory. Almost like lattice is what this reminds me of. The only one that I can think of that doesn't have this is the shagbark hickory. But most of our other hickories will have this thatched bark pattern. A couple of our oaks, the one on the left is a northern red oak, and I like to think of those as having ski trails in them. If you look at that, you see those paler lines, like somebody's been skiing or bobsledding, and they've left these patterns. That's a northern red oak. And then the white oak on the right, that be lighter in color. There can be quite a bit of variability in the white oak bark. If it's on a site where it's not getting a lot of nutrition, sometimes that bark will be very tight. If it's growing quickly and it's well suited to the site, it'll be more flaky, but it is going to be a lot paler usually than the red oaks. American beech, it doesn't change very much from a young tree to an old tree. It's going to have that smooth gray bark. But if you look at it close to a red maple, a young red maple, they can sometimes look very similar. So that's a beech on the left. That's a red maple on the right. But as the red maples get older, they'll tend to be more flaky. But when they're young, they can be pretty hard to distinguish. But now that you've seen the buds of each, you've seen those long, narrow buds of the beech, and you've seen the opposite leaf arrangement of the red maple, that should be a good way to tell those apart. Our master naturalist tapped some walnuts recently, and I wanted to throw in that picture of the walnut. And black walnut has a pretty distinctive dark color. You can spot it from a distance because of that dark complexion that it has. And it's another one of those that you can judge by the sight, because walnuts typically like to grow in a bottom. So you'll see them around barnyards, you'll see them in backyards, you'll see them in bottomland. And we talked about the seed structures. Anybody know what this one is?
Sweet gum?
That's a sweet gum. Had those all around our house when I grew up. I don't see as many in Wise County. I know they're around, but I don't know. Those of you in Letcher and Harlan County, you might comment as to whether they're common there, but really nothing that looks like that. It can be confused sometimes with the sycamore seed balls, but they are pretty different. So look for those types of things when you're trying to ID a tree. These will be on the ground all through the winter and can help with your ID. The general shape can be helpful. On the left is an American elm, and it's usually described as being vase shaped. So you can see even in the winter with the leaves gone, you can see that vase shape. To me, it reminds me of a head of broccoli, the way it kind of grows up. And then on the right, the tulip poplar, that's the tallest tree that we have in the eastern US. It can get up to 200 feet tall. And usually, unless it's got a lot of sunlight hitting and it doesn't need to compete with other trees, it's going to be tall and straight, just like this. So the general shape of the tree can help with your identification. Again, we talked about looking at those old leaves, seeing what the average is around the base of the tree you're trying to ID. That can be really helpful. And that's not cheating. That's just using tools that are available. This is a word I learned just a few years ago, marcescence. That's a good way to identify the tree, certain trees. And marcescence is just those old leaves hanging on. This picture was taken last week, so this was taken as late as February. But the pale leaves you see, those are beeches. And the ones that are more dark brown, those are red oaks. Those are both known for having considerable marcescence. Those leaves will hang on all winter long. So that's a good way. You can identify red oaks and you can identify beeches from 100 yards away just because of that marcescence and those leaves hanging on there. Certain diseases and parasitic plants, those can also be a way to identify. And the one on the far left is one I just learned a couple weeks ago when I hiked with Elizabeth and Adam Boring, who has a strong interest in fungi. I had seen these small trees in the past with what looks like black velvet on the trunk and never really given it much thought, but Adam wanted to get a closer look and identify what that was. And we noticed that this just kept showing up on black gum trees. So when I was collecting the twigs for this exercise, I was walking through the woods and I was looking for this particular black velvety fungi. And sure enough, when I saw it in the distance, that's where I went over and collected my black gum twigs. The one in the center, I showed you earlier a northern red oak trunk. Scarlet oak can look very similar, but it tends to grow on drier sites, poorer sites. And the scarlet oak will almost always have this canker at the base. And does anybody know what that canker is?
It's the same thing associated with chestnut blight, isn't it?
Yes, that's the American chestnut blight. It moves from the chestnut into the oak trees, and scarlet oak, for whatever reason, it's the one that shows the most symptoms. It'll show this huge canker. And before I learned that, I assumed that scarlet oaks for all eternity had grown with this, but this was a result of chestnut blight being introduced into this country. And on the far right there, that's mistletoe. We have 12 species of mistletoe in North America, and each one of those is associated with a different species of tree. So it's just a matter of knowing which type of mistletoe is more common in your area. I know when I lived in Whitley County, Kentucky, if I saw mistletoe, I knew that was a black gum tree. But if you go to central Kentucky and you see mistletoe, it may be a species of oak. So it's just a matter of knowing what type of mistletoe you have and where you're likely to see it. And then finally, a couple of things that we'll talk about as far as identification. On the left, that's a basswood. And basswoods, when you have a mature tree, you'll get these basal sprouts that are very common. And Aaron, I think once upon a time you had a basswood. We were trying to figure it out if it was a basswood, and I mentioned that. And I don't know if that ended up being helpful at all, if we ever saw the basal sprouts, but that is a good way to identify mature basswoods from those basal sprouts. And then on the right is an example of what's called epicormic branching. Certain species, they might have a nice smooth trunk, but as soon as there's an opening in the forest and sunlight hits that trunk, you're going to get a lot of little branches and little leaves growing on the trunk. And two that are particularly bad for that are white oak and tulip poplar. So if you're seeing, even in the winter, if you see a lot of epicormic branching on the trunk of a tree, you see those twigs growing out in clumps, then you could probably narrow it down to 2 or 3 species that you may be looking at. And I think I'm about a minute over, so sorry about that, but I'll try to answer any questions you all may have. I'll stop sharing this. And I know that was kind of a whirlwind ID, but at least I hope you'll hang on to these twigs and look at them a little more closely, and maybe try to match them up with the trees around your backyard and in places that you may frequent. And I think you'll start to see a lot of differences and start to see a lot of those patterns emerging again and again, and be able to identify some of these species.
Great information, Phil. I'm glad you condone the cheating of last year's leaves.
Yeah,
I tend to do that myself, so
I do that a lot.
I'm glad I have a forester that actually backs up the cheating.
Just remember the wind blows.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Well, that's why I said take the average. If you might have something that blew in, but if you've got more of one species than another, that's what I would go with.
I learned a lot from this exercise. I've always just depended upon the tree form, even if it's a small sapling and bark.
Mhm.
Never really paid that much attention to twigs.
Right.
I must have slipped through those courses at UT.
Well, it's a good way to ID them. It's and like I said, there's not a lot of variability from one set of twigs to another if you're looking at the same species. So it's a pretty reliable way to ID. All right. Well, thank you all. And I guess Thursday, we have Dr. Mike Goatley from Virginia Tech. He's going to be talking about spring lawn management, just giving some tips for having a a healthy and productive lawn. So he'll be joining us on Thursday evening at 6 o'clock.
Sounds good. Looking forward to it.
All right. Y'all have a good evening.
Good to
Thank
see
you,
everybody.
Phil.
Thanks.
You
Bye-bye.
see you.